back to Cinematic. I'm Ryan, and I'm making my way through a big old long list of Kung Fu movies that I made myself. So really there's nobody else to blame. Actually, you might be to blame as well, but we're all in this together. And the way I compiled that list, it seems, changes from movie to movie. This time, I can tell you the two reasons why this particular movie made the list. Drunken Tai Chi from 1984 is Donnie Yen's first starring role, I believe is how they put it, because he was around for some stunt work, although the only movie I can find on IMDb that credits him as uncredited is for the Miracle Fighters from 1982, which was another Yuen Woo-Ping movie, which we'll get to him. But I've actually been working backwards a little bit on this one. Donnie Yen was an early favorite in this family. Myself and Evelyn, my daughter, watched the Ip Man movies, I think somewhere between 3 and 4. So the first 3 were already out, and the 4th came out along with Master Z for that matter. And then we watched those as well. So I had a good idea of who Donnie Yen was and how just amazing that guy is. So kind of working my way backwards with this one a little bit, but I've also seen him in John Wick 4, was it? And no doubt the XXX movie, The Return of Xander Cage also, which he's actually pretty good in, honestly. That movie, you maybe could take it or leave it, but Donnie Yen has yet to turn in a bad performance for my money, I'll say, in whatever movie he's in. And in Drunken Tai Chi, as his first starring role, he is quite a bit younger, as you might imagine. And even though he had done some stunt work, that's not where his story begins. If you'll remember in the last episode where we talked about 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, we talked about how Carl Wei had done some weapons training with Bao Sim Mark, who is actually Donnie Yen's mom. So Donnie Yen in Bao Sim Mark had a Fu-style Wudang Quan at his hands, which is a new term for me. Again, learning as I go here. But I could pick out the Wu-Tang out of there, to use the common English pronunciation for anybody that's familiar with the Wu-Tang Clan. Where that comes from is that within Chinese martial arts, or Wushu, there's a lot of different groups, but there's 2 big groups. In Wudang, or Wu-Tang, so named for the Wudang Mountains, and Shaolin, so named for the Shaolin Monastery. So I was able to pick that out of there. What I didn't know is that signifies a number of styles. I guess there's a bunch of styles to Shaolin, but there's relatively few to Wudang Quan, and that's because they are largely focused on centering the mind to control the body, I guess, if I understand correctly, and I'm sure I don't. But one of those styles is, of course, Tai Chi, which I think definitely jives for what I know. I feel like Tai Chi is a pretty well-known style within the States. You know, there's probably more than a few soccer moms out there that could tell you a thing or two. But Donnie Yen's mom, Bao Sim Mark, was a Tai Chi Grand Master. So Donnie was able to pick up quite a bit at a very young age. At 16, he went to train with the Beijing Wushu team, and just 2 years later was when he auditioned for Yuen Woo-Ping. And I didn't look at how that lines up with the Miracle Fighters, but 2 years after Miracle Fighters, so in 1984, was this Drunken Tai Chi. So that's the first reason this ended up on my list. This is another one of those movies that didn't end up on my list because I kept reading about it or kept seeing it. It was just that I saw it was Donnie Yen's first, starring role, and that it was directed by Yuen Woo-Ping, which is the other reason I put this on the list. We've talked about him before. I'm tempted to say I've talked about him enough, but I think we all know that's not possible. This is the 5th movie of his we're talking about so far, and it won't be the last. But you will see right in the credits, as this thing gets going, that the martial art direction is by Yen's clan. And we just barely talked about how, in fact, what was that? Going back, Project A probably, how the idea of these troops, these really family units of martial artists that were kind of just congealing almost automatically the more films they worked on and worked with each other. And we talked about the Singabon with the Jackie Chan stunt team. There was also a Hung Gabon for Sammo Hung and even Yuen Gabon for Yuen Biao. So Yuen Woo-Ping was no different, I think, in that he was probably directing a little bit more than those other two, although that's a good question. I wonder who turned in more movies. So Sammo, this is all according to IMDb, does have 37 directing credits to his name, whereas Yuen Woo-Ping has 30, Jackie Chan has 17, and Yuen Biao actually does have 2, which I knew they were both going to be on the bottom of the list there. But Yuen Woo-Ping definitely more of a director, whereas Sammo I still feel like is more of a performer. I don't know. I guess that's an interesting question that many people probably disagree on, that I'm not going to settle here and certainly shouldn't try. But I will say for Drunken Tai Chi, for the movie at hand here, that Yuen Woo-Ping did direct, it is characteristically on point when it comes to the action direction. So whoever made up the Yuen's clan did a fantastic job with this movie. It's still pretty top-notch and incredibly varied this time around. Like, they go out on some limbs. We start out with a bike fight of sorts, and it's not even like, we just saw one in Project A too, where Jackie did a whole bunch of cool stuff with a bike down a bunch of alleys. You've probably seen it on YouTube too. It's one of those ones that pops up quite a bit. Here, they're like using the bikes to hit each other in some really interesting ways that I didn't quite expect. There's also what might be a skateboarding scene later on, and I'm probably putting all of these up front in the quick little clips that I start these videos with. But just stuff I wouldn't expect, right down to when they do a puppet fight, which I feel like when I normally talk about something like that, especially when it comes to Yuen Woo-Ping, we've talked about this for Snake and the Eagle's Shadow. Lau Kar-leung was not afraid to do this either, but I feel like when we hear the term puppet fight, we're like, oh, it's one of those fights where somebody's kind of moving the other person from behind, and it's this really interesting choreography, this problem that they have to solve. Maybe one of the guys doesn't know Kung Fu, so it's the other guy actually using it through him. Really cool stuff so far. But no, I'm talking about a puppet, like a literal puppet fight where one of the guys is using a puppet that's doing the hitting. So it's kind of goofy, as you might imagine, but it's also a little indicative. Yuen Woo-Ping, I first saw his work when it came to The Matrix. And I think what blew me apart about The Matrix, if you want to put it that way, is all of the attention to detail with the choreography and the Kung Fu, all of the little tiny things, like the bit where he's got some 1-inch punches in there, I feel like. Just all of that stuff I was completely unfamiliar with, had never seen before. Obviously had been going on for decades already with the stuff I now have been watching, but with this goofy puppet fight, I feel like I'm seeing shades of that even when it comes to Yuen Woo-Ping. He's just so good at the minutia of Kung Fu, like the geometry of even just the smallest parts of the body and how it interacts or can interact in a sometimes violent but certainly explosive way. Lots of exploding going on in this episode. And I'm still not done. On top of all of that, there is a literal b-boy routine that Donnie Yen goes through, which now I am over the moon excited. I had Mismatched Couples on my list of movies to watch. It's this really weird, and there's this greater conversation to be had if you watch, I get the title name wrong every single time, Iron Fists and Kung Fu Kicks was this documentary that was on Netflix and might not be anymore anyway. But they talk about how, especially due to those grindhouses, this whole Kung Fu thing was something that got picked up among disenfranchised folks or people on the outskirts. Like a lot of it just literally bled out onto the streets, just right out the doors of those grindhouses, I feel like, and even crossed over into the b-boy culture from what I understand, again, according to that documentary. So I had Mismatched Couples on my list because of that, because I thought it was a just fascinating intersection. Now I see that Donnie Yen literally has the skills. And I've seen some criticism that this is also the thing that makes the movie a little too dated or of its time. It almost seems like they were just, putting in as many fads as possible, especially when it came to the skateboarding, or the b-boy stuff. But I think it's great. I know nobody's probably surprised by that at this point, especially since I feel like I'm getting used to or even learning to love how some of these movies can be so all over the place. Because if you're wondering, after all of that, like, wow, how do they fit it all together? Then they don't really is the answer. Even for an 80-minute movie that still kind of takes a bit to get going, I feel like. Essentially, Donnie Yen's character, Chin-do, is kind of in a rivalry with this other guy, him and his brother, and they get into like this fireworks fight wherein they are victorious, and the other guy is not only humiliated, but like mentally damaged because of it. So his father hires an assassin to kill Chin-do and his brother and his father, and the assassin, who by the way is actually Yuen Woo-Ping from Dreadnought, like the silent killer from Dreadnought, basically reprises his exact role. I don't think he does have some lines in this one, but is for the most part, definitely when he's killing, very silent. But it reprises his role for this movie, does kill Donnie Yen's character, Chin-do's father and brother. And so Donnie Yen takes up with a puppet master who is responsible for that fight earlier on in the film. But wait, the puppet master is actually married to an overweight girl that Donnie sold a dress to earlier in the movie. And they're trying to have kids. And the puppet master and the overweight girl, not Donnie, he wasn't. But that ends up contrasting nicely with the fact that the assassin himself does have a child and is trying to be, it seems, the best father possible. But his kid is, let's say, lightly trafficked about halfway through the movie, and Donnie Yen is able to rescue him in front of the assassin, who now has a conflict that doesn't seem to really rattle him at all. He still tries to kill Chin-do throughout the rest of the movie. But Chin-do barely escapes at one point, takes back up with the puppet master, and begin montage. Because that puppet master is probably the drunken Tai Chi master, which I've also seen some criticism that's like, this doesn't quite rise to the level of drunken master. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't, like, because they don't ever even mention that. Like the Tai Chi puppet master does drink, and there are certainly some, I was able to recognize some drunken boxing in there, but by no means is that like kind of any part of this movie really. So it's a bit of a misnomer. You get the feeling there's a little bit of a cash-in going on there with the title, I will say, for sure. But with all of that going on, I will say, it doesn't follow kind of the regular beats that you're used to. Like even when it comes to the montage where Donnie Yen's character is trying to learn from this Sifu, like Donnie Yen kind of already has it together more than the Sifu at some point, and the Sifu himself isn't perfect, so it zigs where others zag, but it probably just more zigzags like crazy throughout the rest of the thing. Eventually, the revenge that happens to the father that hired the assassin, but the assassin is the essential final fight in the movie. And it's all, I'm underselling all of the choreography, I feel like. How much can you say at some point? But it is good, and it is probably also the best part of this movie, which is still probably a little rough. It's rougher than other movies we've seen so far. Wildly enjoyable for some of the reasons I've already talked about, but you definitely gotta take a step back, you could say, because it is also still probably first and foremost a kung fu comedy. Like it is ratcheted up to 11 probably in this thing as well. Even when it's not choreography or acrobatics, it is just lousy with boings and cross eyes and additional sound effects, not excluding fart jokes and crotch shots. So 5 out of 5 stars. Very technically proficient stooging is back in full force. And even if it's all a little all over the place, speaking of which, the final fight is literally all over the place. Like they're throwing them in and out of windows, in and out of doors. It's a little confusing, especially for Yuen Woo-Ping, who I feel like has a mastery over kind of location and who is where at what time doing what to who else. I might have got a little lost at the end of this one, but it's not to say it isn't worth watching. I would never say such a thing. You might still want to check out Drunken Tai Chi if you can find it, honestly. I know it's out there streaming just straight up on YouTube. I've become aware of the magic of just searching for some of these videos, movies, on YouTube itself. And if you can't just find the entire thing up there, like if it isn't something that Celestial or Fortune Star hasn't, finally decided to do a re-release of, they're pretty available just straight up on YouTube. So that's been nice, but I don't think this is one of those. So you might still have to work a little bit at it, but kind of worth it in the end, which is also how I describe Ryan Runs. If you want to head on over to patreon.com/Ryan_runs_ or the brand new PayPal donate button. If you're not so much into the subscriptions, even though I greatly appreciate that because I am putting stuff out on a weekly basis, and I don't do enough to thank my patrons. I don't do enough to thank my subscribers, but I should mention every single time, every single place, with every single video, this doesn't get done without that. It's a lot of work. It's more work than it should be at times, but if you're not so much into the subscription, now you can go over to that PayPal donate button and just drop however much you want in the tip jar there. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you as always for watching these, and come back next time for, if everything goes smoothly, Wheels on Meals. And yes, I am saying that correctly, but failing that, it might be My Lucky Stars. So at least one from that Lucky Stars trilogy that we kind of talked about a few episodes ago. So thanks as always. See you guys then.